You just heard a demo of the Fullerton Bright model that's found in the HX Stomp and the Helix series. It is a model of a 50s Tweed Deluxe amp from Fender, more specifically the 5C3 circuit. Unfortunately, Line 6 decided to model the 5C3 and not the 5e3 circuit, which is kind of widely regarded as the best or the most desirable circuit for Tweed Deluxes. I'm not sure why Line 6 did this, but from what I've read and what I understand, they're really similar, and the 5C3 tends to have just a tiny bit more clean headroom. In this video, we're going to compare my recently built 5e3 Tweed Deluxe clone from Trinity Amps with the 5c3 model in the HX Stomp. I think you'll find that they sound really close and really similar. And even though it's not a circuit by circuit comparison like some of my other videos, I think that it's worthwhile to hear a modern built Tweed Deluxe copy compared with the model, and ultimately shows how good the HX modeling is and how it compares to a real amp. To kind of level the playing field, we're going to be using the same IR or impulse response on both the modeler and the amp. I'll be running the amp direct using my 2-notes captor. I've explained this setup in a previous video, so make sure you check that out if you have any questions about the setup. But the IR that I'm going to use was made from a Weber 12A125A Alnico speaker, which is an American style Alnico speaker that is widely held as a great replacement speaker for a Tweed Deluxe style amp. And I have to say, after switching from a Celestion Gold, I really like the Weber, and it's a great fit for this style amp. Now we're going to take a listen to some direct comparison, A/B back and forth, and then after that I'll share with you guys a few just brief thoughts on how I think they compare and my experience with dialing them in. All right, let's get into it. So what we just heard is two different settings, a semi-overdriven sound and then more of a crank sound with the Les Paul. In both of them, we hear that greasy Tweed Deluxe overdrive sound that has just become a really classic sound. Hopefully between the different guitars and the different settings and the different types of parts, you were able to get a good feel for how the modeler compares to the amp. Are they exact? No, and understandably so. They're not really the same circuit, but they both sound really, really close. I did find that the HX model does lack some bass compared to the real amp. That's kind of surprising because the amp has actually been modified to have even less bass than it would stock. So, you know, I did try to compensate for that on the HX and get them as close as I could. But even in doing so, I still felt like there was some, you know, some real kind of meaty low end that the amp had that the HX Stomp did not. Now, in other comparisons, when I've talked about things like this, people have mentioned using an external EQ or another EQ outside of what we have to use on the actual model. And for the point of comparison, I try not to do that just because I do want to see how the model compares with the amp. You know, it doesn't mean that we can't get them closer with an EQ. I actually think that we could in this case by boosting some lows as well as tweaking some mid-range to get more of that in-your-face feel that I feel like we typically get from amps when we compare them to the modelers. But, you know, for the sake of comparison, I just really want to limit the number of variables and compare the model directly with an amp as close as we can. Like I just mentioned, I typically find that when I'm doing these comparisons that the amps sound more in-your-face. I found that to be the case with the Matchless, the Deluxe Reverb. The Marshall actually was really close, but especially on the Matchless and the Deluxe Reverb and this Tweed Deluxe, I found that there's just a mid-range presence that the amp has that just makes it feel more forward. This is definitely an EQ thing in the mid-range that could be adjusted and tweaked, but again, for the sake of the conversation, that is one difference that I find to be the case over the course of, you know, doing these comparisons on several different models. The other biggest thing that I've found to be a difference is just the response. They respond differently. I find that when I dial in a part or a sound on the HX and I'm comparing it to the amp, then maybe I'll play one part and they sound really, really similar, but then I play a different style part without changing any settings, and it just responds differently. The HX responds a little differently than the amp would. That's not to say that it's bad, it's just different. And so especially when I'm tweaking the amount of sag that the amp has or how it's overdriving, that tends to vary in different ways on the HX Stomp than it does with the amp. If you're familiar with Tweed Deluxes at all, and I found this to be the case on the modeler, which bravo to Line 6 for incorporating this because it's a huge part of the Tweed Deluxe sound, is that the volumes are really interactive. So even though we're plugged into the bright channel on a Tweed Deluxe, when we adjust the normal channel, even though we might not be plugged into it, it affects the overall sound. As we turn up the normal volume, even if we're plugged into the bright channel, we will get less gain and the mid-range kind of shifts and adjusts. So that's something to be aware of if you're using this model, if you're tweaking this model, that even if you're on the normal or the bright, as you adjust each volume, they're going to have some interplay and affect each other. It's kind of part of the charm of the Tweed Deluxe. And in the end, it's kind of a design flaw that's become one of the really cool things about the amp. Another thing that I found with this amp, and especially with this amp because of how a Tweed Deluxe sounds cranked, it literally just sounds like it's about to blow up. And I find with modeling in general that it doesn't quite have the same magic when we get to that point. All of the inconsistencies and kind of the amp fighting itself in the way that a real tube amp does when it's pushed to its limits. The modelers, they do a good job of recreating that, but it's not quite the same. It doesn't quite have the same magic. And I feel like especially on this amp, we hear it just because the Tweed Deluxe is known for that sound. Neil Young has made that, part of his sonic signature in a way. And so while the HX again, does a good job of it. It's not quite there and doesn't quite do it in the same way as an actual Tweed Deluxe amp does. I've mentioned this before, but one of the pluses about the HX modeling is that we a lot of times get more variables to tweak the amp, which is really cool. You know, whereas my Tweed Deluxe has 2 volumes and a tone control, in the HX, when I'm using this model, I have my volumes, my tone, I have a bass and a tone, bass and a treble control, and then I have different sag and bias adjustments, all that can be used to tweak the amp even more. So if I have a sound in my head that I'm going for, having those options is really nice, and it really allows me to dial in the sound another step further than I would be able to with the, than I would with the actual amp. If you've made it this far, thanks so much for watching. In the description below, there are links to presets and impulse responses that I used in this video, as well as some Amazon affiliate links. All of those are great ways to support the channel. Another couple of easy ways that you can support the channel are hitting the subscribe button and hitting that thumbs up button if you like this video. I started doing this at the beginning of 2020, not knowing what the year would hold, and the response here has been amazing. I've been really grateful for the outlet to just put out music and talk about gear and make videos and all of that. All of you guys' feedback has been amazing, and I've just really appreciated you guys tuning in. So you guys keep watching. I'm going to keep making videos, and until next time, I'll see you out there.